As we've been reporting over the last few days or week, really, tensions have been rising on the Korean peninsula. The North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, has been seen with big maps pointing to potential target sites for ballistic missile and nuclear attacks. US bases around the Pacific are understood to be in the sights of North Korea should it carry out any of these threats. But, you know, we've heard such threats before. How seriously should we take them? We're now joined by Dr. Emma Campbell from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
We have heard a lot of bluster from North Korea before. We now have a new and young leader in North Korea. How do you judge what's going on at the moment? Is this just Kim Jong-un trying to assert his authority, or is this something a little different?
Yeah, I think it's a very tense situation that we're seeing at the moment, but I don't think we should be too panicked. As you said, we've seen some of this bluster and rhetoric before. I don't think that the North Koreans are capable of carrying out many of the threats that they've made.
Certainly, nuclear attacks on the US mainland, for example.
On US interests, yeah.
But on interests around the region, Guam, Hawaii, South Korea, certainly it has capacity to do that.
Not so much Guam and Hawaii, but of course North Korea has tremendous conventional capacity and has shown itself to be quite threatening to the south. But I think any large-scale attack would prove to be almost suicidal for the North.
Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State, has said that it would be regime ending if they did embark on that. So suggesting the US would have a pretty powerful response.
No, that's right. But I think the problem we see at the moment is this constant tit-for-tat provocation, and the whole situation is just getting worse and worse. And I think whilst we might not be worried about a huge escalation, the kind of skirmishes that we saw around about 2010, when you saw the sinking of the Cheonnam and the death of 46 young South Koreans, might be the kind of incident that we'll be facing again very soon if people don't step back and look at an alternative way at dealing with what is currently going on the peninsula.
Let's look at how the US is dealing with this at the moment. It has deployed stealth fighter jets from Japan to South Korea. It's used that sort of language that I referred to earlier. Are you suggesting that the US should be a bit more cautious, a bit more hesitant in its response?
Yes, I would really call upon the US to be a lot more cautious. I think many people believe that the North is acting in the way they're acting because they feel provoked or threatened by the US, and the kind of reaction you've seen by the US, I think, just causes that sense of threat to be increased. And then,
in what way is North Korea threatened by the US? The US just wants stability, doesn't it, on the Korean peninsula?
Well, I think examples of other countries, for example, Iraq and Libya, do make the North Koreans rather concerned. And it is a dreadful regime, there's no doubt. That is not guaranteed its future because of the horrors it inflicts on its people. So it's not a stable regime, and it fears a lot from the US and from outside influences, I think.
But it's the North Koreans who've developed this nuclear arsenal they talk about. They keep building ballistic missiles and continue this nuclear program in defiance of international sanctions. So is the US really supposed to do nothing here?
No, absolutely not. I mean, they shouldn't be doing nothing. They're doing the wrong thing. The problem with North Korea is not just the nuclear problem. The problem of Korea is the whole Korean problem, the issue of a terrible regime that is overseeing a huge starving population. Now, what we want to see is change in the regime and a better situation for its people. Now, the current situation of preventing humanitarian aid from getting there, further provoking the North, is not either helping undermine the regime, nor is it helping the people in North Korea.
And would you include the threat of additional sanctions, including from Australia, that's not helping either?
Well, I think there are different types of sanctions. So I think some of the sanctions that are directly targeting the nuclear program, I completely accept. But there are also some sanctions that are targeting humanitarian aid and linking humanitarian aid, or sorry, not sanctions, but a program to reduce humanitarian aid going into North Korea that is being pushed by the international community. And that humanitarian aid and the trade, for example, that comes from China is the one way where we can introduce new ideas, opportunity, buy, DVDs from South Korea, which is how they come in from China. And this is how we can change the ideas of the North Korean population and try and encourage reform.
Just on China, the Prime Minister will be there at the end of this week. What do you think she can and should say to the Chinese about North Korea?
Yeah, well, I think when Prime Minister Gillard goes to China, she's, I guess, not really in a position to tell China what to do. But I think it's a great opportunity for her to understand China's position, to perhaps hear more about China and what they are doing in regards to North Korea, things that China cannot perhaps speak out about publicly. But I am very disappointed with Minister Carr, who has only followed the US by asking for additional bilateral sanctions by Australia. When Australia, when it's trying to carve out a middle power position, it has a seat on the UN Security Council, could be doing something much more constructive. For example, allowing the embassy to open and creating a channel of communication,
the North Korean
embassy, and I think that would be a great step forward, because they are allies of both the US and South Koreans, and the South Koreans. They would work alongside the US and the South Koreans, but would perform a role of a neutral and cooperative and effective communicator with the North Koreans, as they have done in the past. And I think this is a real missed opportunity by Minister Carr.
Just finally, when we look at whether this is just bluster or whether it is something more serious, there's been a lot of commentary pointing to this industrial park that's just over the industrial precinct, Kaesong precinct, just over the border in North Korea. There's, I think, 120-odd South Korean firms that use cheap labour in there. 50,000 North Koreans are employed there, and the salaries go directly to the regime in North Korea. Now, Kim Jong-un has threatened to close it down. If he does close it down, what do we read into that?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's a very important source of income for the North Koreans. I think it is a further step to try and pull back from the international community and isolate North Korea.
Because he'd be sacrificing, as you say, a significant revenue source if they do it.
Yeah, and I think it will be a terrible shame, this great method of communicating between the South and the North to be closed down alongside the tourist resort that was also closed down around about in the mid-2000s. So I think it will be a real shame for the Korean Peninsula and for future peace and prosperity if that is put an end to by the North.
Dr. Emma Campbell from the ANU, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Of course, yes.